fairly complete and well understood, but I think the interannual and the seasonal variations are still not clear, and so there's still work to be done there. Then we moved on in the afternoon to the benthic processes, and in some sense, this was an important link because the benthos plays an important role in that remineralization and in the biogeochemical balances and cycles in the inlet. Depending on your focus, if you're focused in and at the sediment interface, then you may think the benthic plays a more dominant role, but there's still a lot happening in the water column. I don't know if it's 50-50, but roughly there's a tremendous amount of remineralization in the water column and then benthos. So Verena led some discussion there. Jackson Chu looking at sort of some of the more macrofauna, the nectins. And Paul Snellgrove was looking right at the interface. Gail presented some work on her forensic work in Saanich Inlet, and she has now deployed up to 17 pigs across the observatory, about half of those in Saanich and about half in the Strait of Georgia. And she just focused on the deployments in Saanich Inlet. And she was finding, and this is sort of one of these fascinating things that we typically don't think about as oceanographers, but she was finding obviously significant variations depending on when she deployed the carcasses in what season to what was happening as far as some, if there was lots of oxygen, for example, in the water, the carcasses wouldn't last more than a week or two, but if we deployed the carcass during a period when there was very low oxygens, she was getting out maybe 4 or 5 months before oxygen returned, and the carcass was then eaten away. We finished that up with some interesting discussions about new instruments and what's going back in the water. Yvonne was talking about putting down more respirometer type measurements and systems in Saanich Inlet. And Fabio finished up by talking about the status of the cameras that will be going back in. We do not have the disco camera or the controllable pan and tilt camera that has been one of the more successful instruments on the observatory for producing papers in the water at the moment. Plans are to get that back in the water this year. We do have a 3-dimensional camera, and Fabio showed that. It's a rather elaborate camera with a ring of cameras around the top looking down at the subject area, and you can reconstruct a 3-dimensional perspective of the subject area. So there's those two discussions, the microbial processes in the water column, then transitioning into the benthic ecosystem. And then we finished up yesterday with a little bit of a demonstration and overview of the data sources for Ocean Networks Canada, and primarily Oceans 2.0. Those will be all captured in the summary report. So today, we're going to have 2 themes again. This morning, we're going to be looking at plankton dynamics. And to finish up the morning, we're going to be looking at some of the larger scale sort of physical, or chemical processes, and then we're going to have a focus primarily on experiments that are ongoing now and planned to look at the physics and chemistry cycles in Saanich Inlet. And then at the very end, and this could easily be an interesting one that could go at the beginning, I'm going to give a little synopsis on my understanding of some of the circulation that happens in Saanich Inlet. We keep hearing repeatedly about the deepwater renewal events. They tend to dominate because they are dramatic, but in fact renewal events are happening almost continuously throughout the year in Saanich Inlet, and we'll see some of that in the presentations today. So to start off with, we have here one of our key HQPs, highly qualified personnel that worked on some of the Saanich data for her thesis work here at the University of Victoria, May Sato, who's done some work subsequently at the University of Washington and is now a postdoc at Oregon State University. And she's come back to update some of the analysis she's done looking at the echo sounder in Saanich.
Okay, thank you, Richard. It's great to be back here, and I'd like to thank the people at ONC for all your effort to keep this Cape Observatory running for such a long time period. I'm very impressed to see all the 10 years of acoustic data series without major interruption, and which is tremendous work, and I'm really thankful for that. And I also want to thank my collaborators for the past few years for this project and for each slide that's appropriate that I put some of their names on it. I would like to thank them in advance. So biological pump plays an important role in the carbon cycle, where the carbon dioxide is fixed through the photosynthesis, and then those phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton, such as copepods and euphausids, and they produce the fecal pellets. Then the gravitational flux bring those fecal pellets out of the euphotic zone to the sediments. And this is an important process for exporting the carbon out of the euphotic layer, and diavertical migration plays an important role by accelerating this process. By actually they move to the bottom like rapidly, and then they excrete at the depths instead of at the surface. However, we don't really know how the variability of the diavertical migration organisms are based on the traditional methods. So just to review, diavertical migration is a visual predator avoidance strategies where they go up to the surface at night, feed near the surface, and come back down just before sunrise. And the difficulty is that because this process happens such a short time period in a long range, so like in Saanich Inlet, they migrate over 100 meters, but then it only happens within 30 minutes. So it's really hard to capture using the traditional sampling methods such as plankton nets. I tried it, and you can only capture like once if you're lucky, and maybe twice. And optical techniques also had limitation in the small size window, as well as the difficulty in using turbid water such as Saanich Inlet. So the acoustic data is actually a perfect tool to provide high temporal and vertical resolution data that we need to resolve this variability. So this is a typical echogram from the Venus Cable Observatory. X-axis is the time, y-axis is the depth, and color shows the intensity of the zooplankton density. So warmer the color is, higher the zooplankton biomass is. So using this acoustic time series data, I examine how the seasonal and internal variability of migration biomass change over 10 years, which has implications for the biological pump. So EchoSounder is deployed on the frame along with other equipment such as sediment trap, ADCP, CTD, and this is a single frequency EchoSounder for at 200 kilohertz, and it's deployed at 100 meter depth. So one of the reasons I try to use the migrating biomass as an estimate is because we don't know how much zooplankton population goes below this equipment, and it depends on the location of oxycline, which varies a lot too throughout the season. I also went out every couple of months to collect the zooplankton samples to identify the major dominant migrating species as well as size distributions using Tacatrol over a year and a half. So I just want to briefly go through how the acoustic sensor works. So if there's a fish in zooplankton scattering layer, and if there's a 38 kilohertz in this application, actually there's a fish backscatter is much stronger compared to the zooplankton backscatter, or zooplankton almost have like small backscattering at lower frequencies. But what happens here is that since we only have 200 kilohertz, both fish schools and highly packed zooplankton layer can have both amount of same intensity of the backscatter. So we cannot really use this backscattering intensity to separate fish and zooplankton. This is how it actually looks like. So this is the 200 kilohertz data, and zooplankton layers showing that dominated by the euphausids layer, and similar like a fishing school just above it, but with similar intensity. Actually, this is the herring school, but they have a similar backscattering intensity. So in order to overcome these limitations of using single frequency, I worked with Dave Marcus to look at how to detect the fish schools without just using threshold. So instead of like just one threshold and then pick out the fish, we consider the size of the schools and then the shape of the school. So if it's a zooplankton layer, it should be continuously, horizontally continuous in a long time scale. But then if it's fish schools, usually daytime fish school look like this packed oval shape. So when we try to remove that, it's not perfect, but then we can still remove majority of the fish schools in this method. Another thing is that if there's an individual fish that's swimming by in the acoustic beam, it appears as a single, like a straight line, which also has a strong signal in the 200 kilohertz data. This one we also removed by combining the threshold as well as the vertical and horizontal continuity of this characteristics, and removed pretty well. Another thing that's probably typical to Sunny Gymnet is because of the strong phytoplankton bloom in spring and fall. There's a consistently high backscatter throughout the day at the surface for that period of the time, which is affecting estimates of the biomass even at night, because it's overlapping with the zooplankton migration at night. So by detecting the minimum value of just the daytime surface scattering, we can remove most of the phytoplankton backscatter. So in addition to these removal techniques, as well as I remove the ABCP interference and surface reflections, this is a 10-year time series of the 3D data cube. That's the first, this part is the one-day echogram that I just showed you, but then you stack these 10 years for this way, to look at more visually look at the 10 years for how variable it is. So you can see that it's correlated with the sunset and sunrise, but it's more than that. It's the migration timing changes, and also the migration biomass is changing from this plot too. So in order to estimate how much biomass is migrating at night, I integrated the upper 30 meter of the water column because that's where the majority of the zooplankton stay in Sunny Gymnet. And this is a top-down view of the previous slides that I just showed. And x-axis is the year, y-axis the time, so like it starts at noon, midnight, and noon of the following day. So this is 24 hours. And this is the nighttime. And you can see that it's clearly matching with the sunset and sunrise, which is shown in this white line. And actually this one I converted to NASC, which is the acoustic estimates of the biomass in the linear scales. And in order to decide how much migration is happening every day, we need to decide that migration, like how long they stay near the surface, and it looks like it's very close to the sunset and sunrise, but it's actually not. So by collaborating with John Dower, Richard Dewey, Jody Kleinman, and Eric Kunze, we found that there's a seasonal variability in migration timing, and instead of just correlating with sunset and sunrise exactly. Actually, sunset during the summertime they migrate earlier than winter, and then when they come down, summertime they come down later compared to the winter time. So we cannot really use just sunset and sunrise as a migration timing. So I applied this method to detect actually the day migration timing daily for 10 years. And this is a time series of the migrating biomass at night. X-axis is the acoustic estimate of the biomass, and this is the 10 years. And you can see the interannual variability as well as seasonal variability, but I want to focus on the seasonal variability first. So this is the zooming image of the 1 year in 2012. You can see that there is a low biomass in the summertime and increased biomass in fall to winter. And this star is where I went out to collect the samples using the Tucker trawls. And this actually shows that this seasonal variability is reflecting the life cycle of the euphotids. So when we start from the spawning season, when they spawn, like in then June and July, actually the juveniles come out, which is small, like about 5 millimeter length, and then they grow toward fall and winter, and this correlates with the size distribution change of the Tucker trawl data. And then they grow that toward April and just before the spawning season. And this pattern is really correlate and really match with what Hughes and in 77 studies based on the plankton nectar. Although the maximum biomass period that he found was like October to November, but in this year particularly, it looks like a little bit wider than that. It starts from like August to November. So the interannual variability, so I plot the previous image and then stack vertically from 2006 to 2015. And you can see that the spawning season is pretty consistent throughout the year for over 10 years. But the maximum biomass seems to be shifting every year. So like 2006, it was much earlier in August. 2012, it's much broader peaks. And 2009 was only like November, October. And another thing that it was very surprising for me was that you can see the high biomass peaks every 3 years almost, like 2006, 2009, 2012, and 2015. And I didn't really find any correlation with temperature, oxygen so far, and also the fish biomass that I removed originally from the data by comparing it. And then it doesn't really explain by the Euphortis life cycle, which is 19 to 22 months, but it doesn't really explain these 3-year patterns. And I'm still struggling for this part. So if you have any ideas, I'll be really happy to talk to after this talk. So to summarize, based on the 10-year time series data, we found that there's a seasonal variability reflecting the Euphortis cycle, low in the summertime, highest in the fall toward winter, and also there's a high biomass peak in the fall, and this has a every 3-year peak, looks like. And these changes in migration behavior has another implication in the physically dynamic ecosystem. So for my postdoc work, I'm examining how the zooplankton change their diavertical migration behavior relative to the upwelling strengths. So in upwelling region, there is offshore transport of the Ekman surface layer, but then the deep waters, there's onshore current. And it's been suggested that diavertical migration serves as a retention mechanism where they go up to the surface. At night, they're transported back toward offshore, but then when they come down to the deep water, they can utilize the onshore current to come back to the shore. However, there is an inconsistency in the previous modeling studies that they don't really show that they can make it to this original level, original location. It's still like it doesn't really work as a retention mechanism. So there's an inconsistency in the literature based on the theoretical work and the modeling studies. And the problem is that we don't know how variable the migration behavior is. It's when they put the modeling studies for the behavior, they just put 2 points, they go up to the surface at sunset and come down for these fixed steps for up and down. But from the SANI-GENERATE work, it's not that simple. So I'm trying to test the 3 hypotheses. One is that the fraction of the population migrating is going to be changing with the upwelling strength. So the stronger upwelling, less population go up to the surface, so that even though they get transported offshore, they can minimize the population loss offshore. The second hypothesis is that they regulate the time spent in the Ekman layer to enhance the retention. And the third is they change the vertical position to enhance the retention. So if they migrate to the close to the surface, that's where the Ekman transport is strongest. But then they can change the vertical position to minimize their transport offshore transport. So I'm trying to use the Ocean Observatory Initiative data to test these hypotheses. So these are the 3 moorings located off Oregon of the Newport, and there's 3 acoustics equipment deployed, and I'm very happy to see that finally they released the data last week, so I can start working on this data set. But it's really important to understand the small-scale changes because these are the ones that control the survival of the zooplankton and fish larvae in in one of the highly productive regions. And life in the plankton involves a balance between behavior and organism's environment. It's not just physics, but it's not just biology. It's just coupling of this. And having access to both Venus Cable Observatory as well as OI Cable Observatory with the very different physical characteristics, I can separate the physical impacts on the behavior and then understand the mechanism of the biophysical coupling in the animal behavior. Thank you.
So thank you, May. It's great to see May when she did her thesis work looked at 3, maybe as much as 5 years. So more recently, she's got that 10-year data cube. This is a non-trivial exercise for her to have compiled that 10-year data set. I don't know how many, probably terabytes of data. It's each day we generate, the echo sounder is pinging every 2 seconds, and it's generating megabytes of data every minute. So a 10-year record is really a massive undertaking for data reduction. So I appreciate you continuing this work. And I also really encouraged by the linkages between perhaps what we're doing at Oceanography Canada with Sandwich Inlet, where there's processes but maybe minimal dynamics, to another observatory, the OOI Endurance Array on the shelf, where there is a brand new observatory, but a much more dynamic environment. So making those connections on a biological research project looks very encouraging. Anyway, any questions? Frank?
Do you see a response to the lunar cycle? Do deposits avoid bright moonlight?
I looked at it. I didn't really see it. I haven't tried for this 10-year time series, but when I was doing my PhD, I tried to see it, and I didn't really see much. And I think one of the reasons is because planets is pretty productive systems. So when there's a phytoplankton bloom is happening, light doesn't really penetrate that far anyway, and then maybe that might be one of the reasons that not really see the lunar cycle response. And wintertime, usually they stop migrating, so it's really hard to say.
Yes.
I understand that what the electrons are reacting to when they go up and down, or react to the light rate. How would they, with regard to the upwelling system and mentioned, how would they know they were going offshore or onshore?
I don't know. I haven't really. I think I just started. I haven't really started looking at the yet, but I think they don't know whether they're going to offshore or onshore. It's just like it's because the plankton might move vertically against the vertical current, but they cannot move against a strong current anyway. So they just go up and they just.
Yeah, but you were saying that perhaps they're going to change their behavior, so they're.
Oh, how they detect
how they know that they have to do that.
I don't know. I need to
Yeah.
look at that more data.
Well, yeah, it's system nutrition, but anyone who's ever been caught in a rip current, you don't know you're way offshore until you look up and you know you're offshore. But you don't know when you're in that current. It's ambient. So, okay, that's the same question. Any other questions for Ray? Good, thank you. So next up is Karen Suchi, and she's been looking at the influence of interannual variation on crustacean zooplankton productivity to trophic transfer efficiency.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting part of the work that I did for my PhD in John Dower's lab. Just to start off, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors who couldn't be here today, unfortunately. This work was made possible because of a collaboration between John Dower's lab and Deanna Varella's lab. And our paper was just recently accepted in Marine Ecology Progress Series, so if anything interests you in today's talk, then stay tuned because it should be out soon. Okay, so my research focuses on energy transfer between lower trophic levels, and specifically between phytoplankton and zooplankton. And obviously, the efficiency with which this energy is transferred between these trophic levels will have an impact on higher trophic levels in an ecosystem. So the general rule in ecology is that transfer efficiency is about 10% in most marine ecosystems, but Polly and Christensen have suggested a range of between 2 and 24% in marine ecosystems. Okay, so how do we quantify the amount of energy available to higher trophic levels? Well, for phytoplankton, we look at primary productivity, and for zooplankton, we estimate secondary productivity. And the thing that I want to point out right off the bat is that while estimates of primary productivity are common in oceanographic studies, estimates of secondary production are far less common. And that's because historically they've often been time-consuming, involving incubations or cohort analyses, and they've often only focused on a single or a few copepod species. And this holds true in Saanich Inlet as well. We've seen a number of primary productivity measurements being made over the years, which continue to date, and Curtis will talk a little bit about that next. And secondary production measurements have not been made in Saanich Inlet prior to this study. Okay, so to tackle the difficulties associated with measuring secondary production, within the last 15 to 20 years, a new method has been developed which allows us to estimate crustacean productivity at the community level. So this method is based on the crustacean molting enzyme chitobiase. And this picture here shows the different life stages of copepods. So when copepods and other crustaceans molt from nauplii to copepodites to the adult stage, they release this enzyme into the surrounding water. And then we can measure this enzyme and make direct estimates of crustacean productivity by looking at the rate of decay of the enzyme. So the main advantage of this method is that this can be done directly and rapidly at sea. So from the time that we collect our water samples to the time that we have productivity estimates, can be in as short of a period of time as 24 hours. Some key assumptions kind of shape the way that we've been thinking about energy transfer in food webs. One is that we tend to think that if we see changes at one trophic level, we'll see corresponding changes in another trophic level. So for example, we often think that if we see higher primary productivity one year, that this will translate into higher primary production in that year. And as I mentioned, this trophic transfer efficiency has been of 10% has been suggested for marine ecosystems. But however, the field studies to actually show that this is occurring and simultaneously measuring primary productivity and secondary productivity are lacking. So this sort of forms the basis of this work, and I wanted to measure simultaneously primary production and crustacean productivity in order to determine how temporal variations in the phytoplankton community and primary productivity influenced crustacean productivity and ultimately trophic transfer efficiency. So I sampled approximately every 2 weeks in 2010 and 2011 at the same station that the UBC group does their sampling, S3. And we sampled from March to August. And we sampled at the same time, roughly, in the tidal cycle to avoid any confounding influences of the spring and the neap tides. So this whole project actually kind of happened by accident and came up over a dinner where we talked about what we could do in Saanich Inlet because it was so easily accessible. So because we were able to get out and measure these productivity rates on a routine basis, this is actually the first study that combines these in situ rates, not just in Saanich Inlet, but anywhere in the world. So as I mentioned, this work was a collaboration. The Varela lab focused on the phytoplankton, obviously, and they collected nutrient samples, total and size fraction in chlorophyll A, phytoplankton community composition data, and of course the primary productivity estimates. And then in the Dower lab, I collected vertical zooplankton toes. I collected individual copepods for fatty acid analyses. I won't talk about that today. But, and then collected crustacean productivity rates using the Kaido-Baez method. So I just thought I'd talk a little bit about the Kaido-Baez method and how simple it is actually in comparison to some of the more traditional methods. So basically what we did is we went out and collected water samples from 6 different depths in the water column. We didn't collect nearly as much water as the UBC group did, and Captain Ken pointed that out almost every time that I was out there. We filter this water for crustaceans. We filtered them out, and then we incubate the water over a set time, either 12 or 24 hours, and we subsample that water over that period of time. And then after that time, we run the enzyme assays and measure the fluorescence, and that gives us an indication of the decay of the enzyme in the samples. And then from those data, we calculate things like stage durations and our production rates. Okay, so as was discussed yesterday a few times, 2010 was an El Nino year in Saanich Inlet, so our sampling actually, we actually sampled through the transition from El Nino conditions in 2010 to La Nina conditions in 2011. So we saw a few different water column a few differences in water column properties between those years. In terms of water temperature, this is in the top 100 meters. In 2010, we saw that the water temperature was slightly higher. Salinity was about the same in both years. And then sigma T we used as a stratification parameter and found that the water column was slightly more stratified in 2011. And all of these changes were combined with the fact that we saw much higher nitrate and silicate values in 2010. So they were actually, in the spring of 2010, these values were about twice as high as they were in 2011. And so these things all contributed to a spring bloom which occurred approximately 2 weeks earlier in 2010. Okay, I won't talk too much about the phytoplankton because I'm not a phytoplankton person, and Curtis will touch on it more after. But in terms of the spring bloom, the initial peak, as I mentioned, of chlorophyll A occurred a few weeks earlier in 2010. So on the x-axis here, you have day of year from March to August, and then the lines are the chlorophyll A values. So the initial peak was a few weeks earlier in 2010, but we saw pretty much the same range of values of chlorophyll A for both years. And then the other thing I wanted to point out was that the biogenic silica, which is the bars here, was quite a bit higher because of the higher nutrient concentrations, and that means that we observed more diatoms in the water column in 2010 compared to 2011. Okay, looking at primary productivity, we saw primary productivity was higher overall in the spring, these are the green bars, compared to the spring of 2011. The initial peak in 2010 was delayed until early summer, so we didn't see a peak in the 2011 primary productivity until around June. However, mean productivity for the for both years was about 1.8 grams of carbon. And this was just a little bit higher than previous values measured by Damien and other groups in the internet. Okay, moving on to the crustaceans, we also saw differences in crustacean abundance between the years. So on the top here we have 2011. We saw that the abundance of certain species like Calanus and Crisius was substantially higher in 2010 than it was in 2011. And there was also the initial peak in biomass occurred a little bit earlier, but only by about a week compared to the 2-week difference in primary or in chlorophyll. And the other thing is that Calanus peaked a number of times in 2011. We saw about 3 peaks in Calanus abundance, and in 2011, Calanus just peaked 1 time in mid-May. Okay, so moving from abundance to biomass, the top panel here is the biomass of the molting crustaceans, so Nauplii and Copepodites, and juvenile stages of euphausids. So the biomass of the molting crustaceans followed a same pattern as the abundance did, which peaked multiple times in 2010 compared to a single peak in 2011. And then when we looked at the adult biomass alone, the highest adult biomass occurred at about the same time during both years, on day 140, which was in May. Okay, so getting to the crustacean productivity rates. So again, we have the day of year on the x-axis and productivity on the y-axis. Crustacean productivity was higher in 2010 than it was in 2011. The most noticeable difference was actually this low productivity that we observed in May 2010. And this productivity occurred, it wasn't because copepods and other crustaceans weren't in the water column. This was actually a time of high biomass in the region. But it just meant that there weren't a lot of molting individuals at the time. And remember that the Chitobias method is based on the molting enzyme. So if there aren't animals that are molting in the water column at a certain time, then you won't detect the enzyme. Yeah, so we saw a similar mid-season decrease in crustacean productivity in 2010, but not until June, and it certainly wasn't as severe as we saw and long-lasting as in 2010. Okay, so in order to calculate trophic transfer efficiency, it wasn't just as simple as comparing our daily rates of productivity, of primary productivity and crustacean productivity. And this is because of the different time lags or the different metabolic rates associated with phytoplankton and zooplankton. And we know that if we see, or the primary productivity that we see isn't instantaneously translated into secondary production. So what we did is we calculated a moving average of 2 of our sampling dates. And so you see these time average values here of primary productivity and crustacean productivity. So they actually represent, each date represents 4 weeks, and it's a moving average throughout our sampling season. So trophic transfer efficiency was calculated by dividing crustacean productivity by primary productivity. And what you can see is we had some artifact values that were really high and, quite frankly, thermodynamically impossible. And because this hasn't been done before, we were kind of wondering what we should do about it, and we decided that we would exclude any trophic transfer efficiency that was greater than 35%. That seemed reasonable to us, and we excluded those values in our calculations of the average trophic transfer efficiency, which was 14% in 2010 compared to 8% in 2011. And then you can also see that even with removing those artifacts, there was substantial interannual variation in trophic transfer efficiency. Okay, so high values of trophic transfer efficiency tell us that there's more energy available to higher trophic levels. And although our values fell within, our average values fell within the 2 to 24% suggested by Polly and Christensen, and that these values are useful on an annual basis, we did observe a lot of seasonal variations from early spring to summer. So in 2010, we saw a range of trophic transfer efficiency from 3 to 32% and 2 to 19% in 2011. So kind of a next step from here would be to extrapolate these results to higher trophic levels in order to determine the impact of this kind of variability at critical times of the year. So for example, during the spring bloom when the match-mismatch hypothesis is more critical. So just to summarize, because we were able to sample so frequently in Saanich Inlet, this is the first study that routinely coupled in situ community level estimates of productivity for phytoplankton and crustacean zooplankton. We saw an earlier peak in primary productivity in 2010, which resulted in more efficient energy transfer throughout much of the year compared to 2011. And this study highlights the need for field-derived crustacean productivity estimates, given that we saw that low productivity can occur even when zooplankton biomass is high. So relying on zooplankton biomass alone might not be sufficient. So just some future directions to think about. I know this will come up again in our discussion, our theme discussion. Obviously, I'm going to say more zooplankton sampling. I'm a little bit biased, but I think that at the very least, having some sort of routine zooplankton sampling in Saanich Inlet to create a time series that we can monitor changes over time. Measuring crustacean productivity over spatial scales, so we kind of sacrifice the spatial aspect of it to get a clear temporal understanding of productivity in Saanich Inlet, but to sample at the mouth and at the head of the inlet as well as at the UBC station would be interesting. And also day versus night productivity measurements. Now, we tried this a couple of nights, and the Katabai signal is actually, you're able to detect changes in migration patterns of the zooplankton. We only had 2 nights of sampling because of shift time, but the fact that you could actually see the changes from day to night in the signal of this enzyme was pretty interesting, and I think it's something that we could compare to the kind of work that May did and use the echo sounder data in conjunction with it. This would be an ideal situation, would be to determine the relative contributions of the plastic food chain versus the microbial food chain in Saanich Inlet. Our trophic transfer estimates, they assumed that primary productivity from phytoplankton was the only energy that was available to support crustacean productivity, but we know that copepods and other crustaceans also feed on heterotrophic protozoa, so this could be something that's addressed in the future. And lastly, ecosystem models. So we've talked a lot about how Saanich Inlet is a model ecosystem in and of itself, and yesterday we sort of brushed upon the idea of modeling in Saanich Inlet. And I think that these types of productivity estimates, in conjunction with all of the other types of data that we've been hearing about, would be really good to input into ecosystem models, and Saanich Inlet's actually kind of the perfect place to do so. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. Just want to say special thanks to Ocean Networks Canada for providing travel support, allowing me to escape from minus 40-degree weather in Manitoba and come here to share this work with you today. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, Frank. A comment. In the 70s, we did some enclosure studies in Cathay, and those data are left at iOS when I retired with Intelligent Changes. These enclosures should have enough primary productivity and zooplankton biomass data that you might be able to mine those reports for some estimates also increase copepod biomass versus primary productivity. They were good studies. A typical study ran 4 weeks perhaps. We boosted a diatom bloom by adding nutrients, so we're always following the fate of bloom. And studies are limited to the copepods we have, the non-migrating copepods that we captured during COVID-19. So that's just a comment for people that those whole data, we're sampling once every 2 days or something for a 4-week period. So we really take a look at the detail of blooms, often in conjunction with some sort of pollution study. That's what we're funded to do, but we always have a control bed with no pollution. So there is some good data if you wanted to find make some use of it. It might help them with the happening.
That's good to know. And I'll let John down on sort of you're representing him while he's out at the
Yeah, good.
Do you consider how your increases fell in the spring heat cycle?
Yes, we only sampled at the same time of the spring pilot cycle.
And which one where?
We sampled in the spring tide, just after the transition into the spring tide. So these estimates are probably slightly underestimates, or they're conservative estimates for the region. But I'd expect that they'd be a little bit higher than the neat tide.
Your enzyme method tells you about the copepod population, right? What influence do you think the positives have on it? Are you able to detect them that way, or is that probably a factor you think that way?
Yeah, so usually, it gives the signal for the entire crustacean community. So in most ecosystems, the copepods would be the dominant crustaceans, but in Manitoba we have the apposite. So a huge part of the signal is probably the apposite.
So that brings to mind a question too. Where in the water column are you seeing molting? Was there any difference between surface and say daytime depths?
Yeah, during the springtime, the molting would take place at the surface in the top 25 meters, and then throughout the season, we saw more molting taking place at the lower depths, or more enzyme.
I had a number of questions, and I will try to condense them down. But you had similar salinity characteristics, but different stratification characteristics. And stratification is dominated by salinity, so and it didn't look like you had weaker stratification when it was warmer, and stronger stratification when it was colder, which seems to be counterintuitive. Is there a paradox there? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was.
The other thing is you've got obviously overlaid on your observations. You already identified that it's an El Nino versus La Nina, and what also changes in those years is the river runoff. And the freshwater sources and the timing of the Fraser River discharge, for example. And you talked about silicate being important. What are the sources for silicate? Because I know the Fraser is a source. So if you've got a large variation in the Fraser discharge, and we do know that sort of that water does filter into sandage. So if you've got an interannual variation between El Nino and La Nina on silicate, one of my flags that goes up is that a Fraser River signature? Not just a local ecological function.
Yeah, so the results that we have are actually counterintuitive to what we would expect from an El Nino and La Nina year, so kind of more complicated, and I think that's probably because San Antonio is isolated. So El Nino and La Nina have an effect on the area, but then there's also just the local dynamics that are. So I would have expected in 2011 to see lower salinity because of that.
And then one last question is the timing. If you're going out every 2 weeks, what's the timing? And maybe Frank would know this, remember this, we'll be sampling every 2 days. How soon after a chlorophyll A peak do you expect to see a productivity peak in zooplankton? What's the transfer time lag? Because if you don't get the time lag right in your sampling, it's every 2 weeks, but in fact, you're seeing a peak in zooplankton productivity a week after phytoplankton bloom, then you're aliasing your estimates. I mean, one time you had over 100% over time. Yeah, so you're losing out. But once you alias it, you don't get that back by filtering. I mean, you don't get all of it back. So and it's a loaded question because on the Voigt profiler, which is just north of S3, we will have a chlorophyll fluorometer, so it's measuring that every day. If that's a proxy for phytoplankton biomass, and we will have echo sounders looking down, and as May showed, we could use that as a proxy for certain species of biomass So now you have a continuous record of and you can look for those timing variations. Steve?
Why would you presume that at the beginning of springtime you have effective unrest?
Because during the neap tide is when the primary productivity would be increased because there's less mixing in the area. So you would see a spike in primary productivity or phytoplankton biomass. So we chose the most dynamic period of time, and also in terms of advection in and out of the.
But there's no time series showing that. That's just sort of theoretical assumption.
Well, Damien's work kind of looked at that on his work on primary productivity. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, in keeping going, we may have time for further discussion at the end here. So next talk is Curtis Martin, and he's going to be looking at phytoplankton assemblages, or assemblage dynamics, and elemental cycling in Saanich Inlet. And I think Curtis is also here. So we did the UBC, and now we're doing the Ubiquitin.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Curtis Martin, and I work in Dr. Deanna Barella's lab here at the University of Victoria. And today I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about phytoplankton assemblage dynamics and elemental cycling in Saanich Inlet. And so, as Karen talked about, our lab is mainly focused on phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are, of course, the microorganisms living in the ocean that undergo photosynthesis. And so they use dissolved nutrients, carbon dioxide, and sunlight to produce energy. And so this makes phytoplankton the ocean's primary producers. And they're actually responsible for nearly half of the globe's primary production. Additionally, phytoplankton form the foundation of marine food webs. And so they're that lowest trophic level, providing energy for higher trophic levels. Also, phytoplankton play a very important role in this carbon export mechanism, and May mentioned this earlier. And so it's this process known as the biological carbon pump. And just to give you a very simplified version of this, basically the surface ocean and atmosphere are in relative equilibrium in regards to gas exchange. And so as phytoplankton bloom and draw out carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, this decreases carbon dioxide concentrations in the ocean, which would, in theory, allow more carbon dioxide to diffuse in. However, a large fraction of these phytoplankton are also recycled in the surface ocean, and this essentially reverses the process, basically restoring that equilibrium. However, a small fraction of phytoplankton do sink out of that surface ocean and are buried in the sediment. And this effectively removes carbon from the surface ocean, burying it as organic carbon, and would allow more carbon dioxide to diffuse in. And of course, this is very important in the context of climate change. And so, again, as Karen mentioned, our lab focused on the euphotic zone in Saanich Inlet with sampling of nutrients, chlorophyll A, phytoplankton taxonomy, and also primary and new production. And this work all began in about 2005, 2006 at both the head and the mouth of Saanich Inlet. And this work was published in a paper by Damien Grundle and others in 2009. And I just want to tell you a couple main things we learned from this work. The first of which being that primary productivity in SANACH is very high. And so what we're seeing here is a figure of primary productivity in grams of carbon per meter squared per year for a range of different northern hemisphere fjords. And as you can see, SANACH Inlet actually had the highest documented primary productivity for these fjords that were included in Damien's paper. Another thing we learned is that phytoplankton is generally dominated by diatoms. And so this is a figure modified from Damien's paper again, and it's showing the percent contribution of two different phytoplankton size classes to chlorophyll A. And so these black bars represent diatoms, which are the larger phytoplankton, and the lighter blue are the smaller phytoplankton. And as you can see throughout large portions of the year, these diatoms are dominating primary productivity. And so we resumed sampling in 2010, 2011, and this was the work in conjunction with the Dower Lab, biweekly sampling at that UBC station, Side 3, and this is the work that will be published in Karen's paper that she mentioned. However, since we now know that diatoms are very important, we also included biogenic silica measurements. And this is because diatoms form these shells made of silica called crustules, which is pretty unique among phytoplankton. And although they have a wide range of morphologies, which you can see here in these great microscope pictures taken by Jennifer Long from our lab, all of these shells are made up of silica. This is interesting because it means that diatoms largely control silica cycling in the ocean, and that, in fact, by looking at silica concentrations, we can gain information about diatoms. Also, diatoms play a very important role in this carbon export mechanism, and this was shown in a paper published by Ken Buselet in 1998, demonstrating that sites of high carbon export are characterized by these diatom-dominated food webs. And so this is kind of the work that has been going on up to this point. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the work we're doing now. So this is sampling from 2012 up until the present. Again, still at that UBC station, but now we're back to monthly sampling. We've also included diatom production, and so the focus of our lab has now kind of narrowed to diatoms and their role in SANACH. And so the first project I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about is something Jennifer Long worked on for her master's thesis and is working on for some papers now. And so what we're seeing here is a mixed assemblage of diatom species in SANACH Inlet, staying with this fluorescent dye called PDMPO. This is a really cool new technique that Jen's been working on. And what PDMPO does is it stains new biogenic silica produced by diatoms. And this is very useful because it allows us to determine silica production for individual taxa of diatoms, even in a mixed assemblage such as this. And what's really great about this is the conventional method up to this point was using cell numbers and or surface area as a proxy for silica production. And I just want to show you why PDMPO can give us a much better idea of what's going on. So one of the things Jennifer did was to look at the diatom species succession in the 2013 spring bloom in SANACH Inlet. And so what we're going to see is on this side the percent contribution of different diatom species represented by the different colors to the number of cells. And then over here what we'll pop in is their percent contribution to PDMPO incorporation. And so in February, what we saw was this Skeletonema species dominated the assemblage numerically. However, if we look at this PDMPO incorporation, again as a proxy for silicon production, we see that the Skeletonema species actually contributed very little to silica production, which was instead dominated by this Thalassiocyra species. This suggests that the Skeletonema species is no longer growing at this point. Moving into March, we saw a bit of a more mixed assemblage, but with this Catostris species dominating numerically. However, Thalassiosira pretty much completely dominated silica production during this month. And similarly, moving into April, we now see that Thalassiosira is dominating numerically, but contributing very little to silica production, which was instead dominated by Pseudonychia and Cattosaurus. And again, this suggests that Skeletonema growth was initiated earlier in the season, so this is when it's growing, but doesn't reach its peak biomass until later on in April. And then finally in May, Pseudonychia dominated both numerically and in terms of silica production. And so what we can take from this is by using PDMPO, we can see that the most abundant species is not always the species contributing most to silica production. And in fact, that initiation of growth leading to a diatom bloom may occur before, and perhaps long before, that species reaches its peak biomass. So that's really interesting stuff that's going on right now. Again, going back to our little timeline here, something I've been involved in more recently is looking at some sediment trap samples using the sediment trap that's mounted on the Venus instrument platform. So that sits on the seafloor of Saanich Inlet at 96 meters, right around that oxygen boundary. And what we wanted to do with the sediment trap was look at the rate of particles sinking to the seafloor and also their elemental content. So what is the particulate organic carbon, particulate organic nitrogen, and biogenic silica content of those particles? And additionally, we wanted to focus on seasonal patterns, and this was so we could compare with our surface data to get a better idea of elemental cycling, and specifically the degree of benthic pelagic coupling, which was kind of mentioned yesterday, so I'm going to get to it a little bit here. For example, if we look at the rate of primary productivity at the surface, how does that compare with the amount of particles sinking to the sea floor? So what we have here is a figure of primary productivity of the surface in grams of carbon per meter squared per day. And what this actually is a combined average of all that euphotic zone data we've been taking since 2005. And what we see is this typical curve we've seen in Saanich for quite a while now, where you have low primary productivity in the winter, you get the spring bloom, and primary productivity remaining high throughout much of the spring and summer, before decreasing back down into the fall. However, if we look at the particulate flux to deep water, so again, this is the rate of particles sinking to that seafloor sediment trap, also in grams per meter squared per day, we actually see this peak occurring in the winter with this kind of steady decrease throughout the year with a little variability into the fall before beginning to increase again. And this again is a combined average of the sediment trap data we have so far. So what we're seeing there is a bit of a mismatch. Well, what about if we look at the elemental content of the surface particles and the deep water particles, so the ratios of elements? So I just want you to focus on the top two panels first here. These are elemental ratios at the surface, and then the bottom two are elemental ratios in the deep water particles. So think the top is the surface and the bottom is the deep water. On the left is the ratio of biogenic silica to particulate organic carbon, and these two axes share the same scaling. And then on the right, the biogenic silica to particulate organic nitrogen ratio. And again, these two share the same scaling. Now this is a bit of a busy figure, so what I want you to focus on is the data relative to the dotted line in each panel. And what that dotted line is an expected ratio that we expect to see in the ocean. So it's actually a modified Redfield ratio to include biogenic silica. And the big takeaway here is that in the surface particles, we see ratios very close to what we'd expect in the ocean. However, in the deep water particles, we're seeing this strong relative enrichment in biogenic silica to particulate organic carbon and nitrogen. And in fact, these ratios are about an order of magnitude above what we expect. So what we are in fact seeing in Saanich Inlet is a benthic pelagic decoupling. And we think this is a result of biological resuspension. And so yesterday we saw a couple presentations on how flatfish get into the sediment and disturb it, and it's spitting it back up to the water column. And this probably sinks into the seafloor sediment trap. So what we're looking at now, using some data from Frank Whitney that he was kind enough to lend us, is some mid-water sediment trap data. And so instead of just looking at what's happening at the surface compared to the deep water, we want to see what happens as particles are basically sinking and seeing how that changes. And early results, it seems to be something to do with the oxygen concentrations at that site. But pretty interesting stuff. A couple of additional projects I just quickly want to touch on. One is a time series of all that data we've been collecting since 2005 in the euphotic. We want to put it all together and get a nice time series of what's going on in Sandogen. And also, something I want to mention that Karina Giesbeck's working on as part of her PhD project is this really cool silica isotope fractionation method. This is possible because diatoms, as they take up silica to produce their shells, actually discriminate against the heavier isotope. So they preferentially take up the lighter isotope of silica. And this basically leaves a signal in the environment that we can measure. And so the general idea is that by measuring the stable isotope of silica in the environment, you can get an idea of silica utilization over larger scales. And of course, as everyone knows, there's a lot of moving parts going into all this work, and so we have a lot of people we'd really like to thank in addition to ONC. And that's all.
Questions? Curtis?
Yes.
Consider going to ONC and say, hey, sediment traps really useless. There it is. Putting it on the bottom or partway up on where it have to be priority.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot for a little while now, because this was part of my honors work that I did about a year ago now. I think it would be interesting, but it's actually, after spending a lot of time with the data, I think we can find a really interesting story with that deep water trap right now. So what we're kind of looking at in our new-ish story is kind of saying how the deep water, or I guess the benthic community, is probably not experiencing that surface signal, because if resuspension is so prevalent as it seems to be, it's not just affecting that sediment trap, but probably affecting the entire benthic community. And so I think it's still an interesting story. And then using this mid-water data, maybe we'll get a better idea of how things are changing.
You see Timor's manuscript?
Yeah.
The same data.
Yeah, I think it's slightly different.
A little different.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Timor's data is very important too. That was talking about sort of focusing on sediments and deeper traps and stuff. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think maybe after we get through this a little more, we'll get a better idea of how useful a mid-water trap will be. But yeah, early results, it seems that in the mid-water we're seeing that surface signal really well, and then not seeing it in the deep water. So it makes sense.
There's some other track data.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a timing problem with my biomass, that I have a lot of biomass right now, but I'm not consuming any food at the moment. And I consumed food over the last few years that is now my present biomass. And I'm not going to sink to the bottom for a few years yet. So it's not surprising to me that I see lots of timing mismatches. And it doesn't mean to me that I'm missing some part of the story. It's a consistent story. But I don't know, maybe I'm simplifying things a little bit.
I have one comment actually on carbon to silicon export from surface waters. I think there's some pretty interesting work in the North Pacific that suggests that zooplankton transport may be as much as 2 times some regions what seeking particles carry out in the surface layer. But I think you have to kind of take a look at especially in a fjord like this where deposits seem to be such bakers and bracers. I think they really drop a lot of the diatom production. So in your simple model of particle flux, don't forget that these posits and copepods, migrators, are taking a lot of material into what your cat might not see.
Right. And so is that, are you talking about through excretion that they're contributing a lot, or like because we did exclude in our measurements we basically took out all the grazers of our samples, so they wouldn't be included in the flux that we have. But
yeah. I think the work in the North Pacific was talking about biomass.
Okay.
It's just how much biomass. But if you look into silicon, there's a different story. It's excreting maybe a depth beyond traps where you might miss some
okay.
flux. Yeah.
Great.
So ideally, what I'm hearing is we probably want to maybe keep the online sediment trap where it is as a reference point, even if it's contaminated with bottom bioturbation, but maybe get a mooring out in the inlet. And from what we were seeing yesterday with this nephroid layer, maybe that Paul showed, maybe it's also, you want to get, I don't know what your guidance is, at 80 meters and another one at 120. So I don't know.
So you know what question you're asking.
Yeah, well, if you just put out one, you may answer part of the question.
I think 50 meters captures certain productivity, and then you want to decide what you're looking at depth.
Yeah, definitely.
You want to know what they transport off from York's paper, for example, transport off the whatever it is on the sides are, they might be a bit deeper than 100 meters, whatever, 120 or.
The neat thing too, though, at that 100 meters is you're near that boundary, so you get to see the cycling of oxygen out.
Right. Well, we sort of migrated into, I don't know if you want to lead a discussion here on what we, and this is exactly what we're talking about now, what we could be thinking about to be planning for, finding the resources to deploy, getting out there and starting to build up new time series that will supplement some of the existing systems and the time series we're now making to answer some of these plankton. And I did like the idea of, again, this looking at the pelagic and the benthic communities, not just sort of one and then the next. They are coupled or decoupled. So Akash, maybe just finish off this to the next maybe 15-minute discussion. If there's any other, coming full circle again about thinking about the void profile has chlorophyll. We've got a couple of stations with an echo sounder, maybe get some biomass there, sediment traps. Is that enough? Are we just supplementing those core observatory time series with some ship measurements? Is that sufficient? Are there more observatory or ship measurements that are needed? So you go through your questions.
Yeah, well, so we have a few minutes before bring the sort of issues up and these questions up, and then we have a longer discussion period at the end of the day, so we can do this discussion. So for the two issues, like I said, and some of the issues that come up in some of these talks are acoustics and intercalibration or calibration of these instruments. So we did a good job of talking about the time series, the longest time series we have for the echo sounder and so there's issues about calibration of the instrument. How often are we calibrating the instrument? We can probably resolve some of these issues in this early part of the discussion. Then we also questioned, would we want to replace the single frequency instrument? So May talked about how there's some difficulty discriminating between fish and zooplankton, and so she has to address her biomass estimates in different parts of the water columns, how to remove fish instruments. So you could perhaps get around that with multi-frequency instruments. Would it be useful to deploy multi-frequency instrument rather than the 200 single frequency instrument? Is that something?
So what related to that, we were talking to May earlier, and the question now is, if we had a multi-frequency, and let's say 38, 125, 200, in addition to 200, would it be preferential, and directly to May, she's looked at so much of that 200, to put the multi-frequency as a replacement at the Venus instrument platform at the node, or in addition at the void profiler, for example, looking down?
There's a single frequency. Right. No, it's okay. It's a single frequency instrument looking downward. It's 200 kilohertz. So.
But if we were to have a multi-frequency in Saanich, where would you put it?
fully because based on the cover of the wider range, like below this 100-meter depth.
Oh, okay. Looking
More like entire, close to the entire.
I think it'd be useful as well because you'd also have some more characters as well. Just the fact that single frequency instrument at 96 meters, no waterfall transformation to go along with it as such. So.
And then the bottom, the upper looking one can still look near the surface one that probably might be missed by the buoy.
Okay.
I think when you're looking down, you're looking down to the heavy sort of biomass. If you look at the 200 kilohertz off the right now, or actually, it's less sensitive because you're actually going through strong reflector areas, and I'm not sure how the compare it. If you were looking to what the downward look one, there might be better off trying to get one at the bottom at the DPS. So this is more like a.
What do you mean by that?
It's always going to be so you're looking at if you're going to clear water and you get your reflectors far away and surface looking down and get your reflectors right away.
You can see any problem on the bottom mounted one because in the daytime at the bottom mounted one we have a fixed substantial layer too, and that goes through the associated hydroplastic.
Yeah, there's going to be that problem with that 100-meter layer that's very small. But it might be something you want to do an experiment first and try to figure out the best way to get there. Okay. Right.
Is it calculated already on the
The single frequency instrument of the wood profile is not calibrated as such.
It's not calibrated, and I think it has developed a ground fault right now, but there's about a year's worth of it. You can take a quick look at it, and you see that it actually is there as well. It's not very sensitive.
maybe the change must be the calibration that might fix the problem because that was originally the problem and when we started making this picture original staff that was one student or some issue that we had to go through that solved the problem because it looked like weaker in the flatter project and that was the one of the
It's needed things like that.
Then there's additional form of calibration is comparing to nets. So that's the contents of the plankton nets. And that's something that I think we could do at some point because since we've had these deployments for some period of time, especially the VIP for 10 years, it would be nice to run it in calibration of sorts. And so you talked about how difficult it is to sample with stratified sampling to catch the migration so quick. So one of the questions that sort of comes to mind is how do you actually design suitable sort of sampling project to calibrate the echo sample with nets? Would you stay on site and just sample for several days and nights over and over again? Would you stretch it out over seasons? What's the most appropriate way to approach it?
I think next samples always have a problem of avoidance behavior, especially resources. So we don't know, like, usually like some of the papers talk about they avoid so much, like at night they capture 10 times more than daytime. So I think the best model would be like using the ship, like calibrating the sounder on the ship, and then go like around those like areas so we can sample the same like water column with the calibrated sounder on the ship.
Right.
Like,
So that's been done, right? In the past, from Dave Max's group, the past on the West Coast, they have these sort of collaborations with if they're the ship data Can we use those calibrations for this time series?
But this one is just accurate. That one is like their lifetime.
The biomass
Calibration of their own, like their ship echo sounder. But what I'm saying is like using a calibrated echo sounder and then intercalibrate that, like on the VMAS to see whether they say that this is the same.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Same signature. So instead of putting out from like the maintenance groups, when they are just thinking it, we can just sample the same water column and they just said that has a fixed temperature in there, whether the approximate of the same time.
Okay, good. So the first issue, I think we can pretty much resolve. That's good. So the second issue I brought was time series. So through all three talks, there was a suite of references to phytoplankton time series of varying length over time. There's very little, as far as I know, for long-term zooplankton time series. So Greg talked about it, so there were at least bag experiments. And there's some periodic interannual sampling. Here spoke with 2 years of sampling, 2 very different years as a response. So one of the questions I have is there an appetite for some long-term zooplankton sampling and phytoplankton sampling? One of the resources we have is this profiler, and Steve is going to talk about that soon, next couple of talks. And so on that instrument, we're measuring chlorophyll fluorescence, and there's a history of chlorophyll fluorescence measurements in Pat Bay as well. On the surface, so we have time series of biomass extensively, and people have an acoustic instrument and a zooplankton counting and imaging device on the BPS. Are those enough? Is biomass enough for a time series, or should we be incorporating more shipboard measurements, like productivity, for instance, otherwise?
Yeah, I guess I'll throw this out. There was an interesting May showed interannual variability that I think we need to understand. Because if you go out there in 1 year and say, okay, I'm going to make my sampling to get the species composition or to set the background, but it turns out to be one of these anomalous years, then your reference is wrong or off. And then obviously we've seen the timing. Timing is always critical. Well, within a year, within a tide cycle, within a season, and within different years. So it's
so biomass for zooplankton is not necessarily an indication of productivity, as demonstrated here. So and I mentioned it's the same case for phytoplankton species as well. So should we be involving?
I'm astounded that some of the data is showing doubling its productivity from year to year, or plankton biomass from year to year. I'm always skeptical that I don't understand quite how that works. The zooplankton data is hard to use. So, but that's one of the things the second site is going to help resolve too, whether the edge of Pat Bay is representative of a very large area or not. Are we looking at, and this is what Parsons and Ian Perry talked about some time ago, fronts can enter the inlet, and maybe we're seeing physical processes that are causing high variability on the edge of Pat Bay, intrusions of water from a satellite channel, something like that, to work that. And Gargett helped Dario and I wrap up so nicely years ago. I think shows that the site down in Bamerton, where the profile is, may be much more stable. There's a gyre there. It's an area that's really nicely driven by neat spring tide cycles and pressure discharge and so on. So that site may start to resolve some of the issues that have been brought up on the node of Pat Bay.
Bay's biomass plots also showed a vary in some years, in particular the year you went out sampling, 2012, a monthly cycle in that you had that monthly, and again, I don't know if that, we talk about spring neap, which is 14 days, but the spring neap is not uniform. There's, one of the springs is stronger than the other spring, and one of the neeps is weaker than the other.
that looked like a pretty robust signal in that 2012 anyway. And some of the other years showed, again, only a bit of a monkey signal. So I think there's patchiness and spatial, both temporal and spatial variability is to be resolved. Maybe shift-based, what's the record or something, I don't know. Maybe coming in and sitting and having a record, sitting there for a whole year, surveying the unit. But we'll interfere with that LNG thing.
The William J. Stewart, for the three Princess Clerks, you get that quick. They're getting rid of other people.
What might you want? The UPS itself, the refurbished feedback board, is pretty neat in diameter or something like that. Could we hang, I don't know much about setting traps, but I have some traps that we need to stand that we directly underneath that. And you could easily then have a very, go out there, you have to put it on, hold it up. The direction where you're hanging close. Right, so that's going to guide it's not like close to the back. It's there.
It's a simple way to do things for sure. You've got the, I don't know what you're thinking down. Hopefully, perhaps in the middle of it.
There could be questions. The same direction, and you could be a problem with sort of probably and stuff like that. Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty.
When you put a void out in the inlet, it's such a resource to
rather than going at it here, recovering that.
oh yeah,
Be much quicker, faster turnaround.
get the sequential sediment traps, you can set it up for something over spring blooms or this is project based kind of thing. I'm imagining.
Okay. All right, well, we have time to do that.
I think so. We can bring in, and certainly continue the discussion on the BPS, the profiler system, and what sort of KVs, what is FAST, next thing.
All right, so we've got a coffee break, and if people come back in here in about 15 minutes, we'll get going with the next one.